of debt, and that's because we were promised a system where we'd never even have to look at our debt, but it's just got worse and worse. We've seen damaging repayment thresholds with their freezes. We've seen interest rates that have let us down.
The Chancellor's budget announcement that she'll be freezing the Plan 2 student loan repayment threshold from 2027 to 2030 is, for me, a breach of natural justice.
This actually mean? Well, what it means is that you will need to earn about £60,000 a year to just even keep on top of the interest.
Those starting in 2023 and beyond in England, compared to those in 2022, could repay up to 50% more in total than their predecessors. That change in 2023 actually substantially shifted the pendulum so that the individual pays more and the state foots less of the bill.
When my three children took out their Plan 2 loans, they were presented with this information from the student finance brochure. And it's quite simple. You'll repay for 9% of your income over a £25,000 threshold. 9%, nothing to indicate that this could change during the lifetime of the loan. No asterisks, no stars to say subject terms and conditions. They assumed, and I assumed, and I expect the vast majority of students assumed that 9% was fixed and guaranteed to be fixed for the 30 years of the loan. Well, I then found out that's not the case because I wrote this email to Joe Johnson in 2017. However, my concern is whether this or any government can retroactively change the terms of the student loan during the lifetime of the loan. And here I'm clearly referring to things like the 9% payback and the loan period of 30 years. Please answer this question with a yes or no. Well, Joe didn't answer, but Department of Education did. And there comes the kicker. If these regulations change, then the key terms and conditions of student loans may change for both new and existing borrowers. So to me, this is the very worst aspect of student loans. You sign up to a loan where you think the conditions are going to apply for the 30 years, and you don't have the absolute protection of that being the case. To my mind, this is a criminal act of mis-selling. Back in 2017, I was kind of lazy. I thought, surely as a nation, we would never vote in a right-wing populist government with a well-known antipathy to graduates. And yet here we are, seemingly poised to vote in reform with a huge majority at the next election. A party which in its 2024 election manifesto pledged to extend the loan period from 30 years to 45 years, half as long again. And that would be an absolute disaster for my three children on their Plan 2 debt if they could apply that retroactively. And it's not just my three children. I reckon the majority of graduates on Plan 2 debt would be seriously adversely affected by this reform proposal. We were always told that student loan plans were meant to act like graduate tax. I can remember Vince Cable telling me this back in the coalition government of 2010. And like any tax, you need a threshold. Like income tax, you need a personal allowance. And that threshold means nothing unless it rises in line with average earnings, or RPI, over the years. And yet, in the 13 years that Plan 2 loans have been effective, the government has frozen thresholds 7 times in those 13 years. Here's Osborne freezing it then, here's Sunak freezing it here, and here's Reeves freezing it here. And now, why they write the regulations that give them wiggle room to say they haven't broken the law, that's just a technicality. As Martin Lewis says, they've certainly broken the spirit of the law. And they do it for the most cynical reasons. Mostly they do it when they've just come into power and they can see that they've got 3 or 4 years of government ahead. And then, like any chancellor, they will go and get more revenue by freezing thresholds. But sometimes they do the opposite. And this, I think, was a very cynical ploy by Hammond, I guess, in 2018, where he actually hiked the threshold above what it would be if it had been linked to either earnings or RPI. And I think that was a deliberate, cynical electoral bribe for the 2019 election that was coming up. They've jiggled around with thresholds. They've made a right pig's ear of it. It started off being linked to average earnings. And then I think in 2025, they said, no, we're going to peg it to RPI. And then they've just reneged on that time and time again. So with Rachel Reeves's current threshold as set in the 2025 budget, the threshold will be just under £30,000 in 2029. Whereas if it had been pegged on any other basis, RPI, average earnings, it would be somewhere between £33,000 and £35,000 to £36,000. Now, the people who really suffer when you muck around with thresholds are the lower earners. It's just like with income tax, when you freeze the personal allowance, the people who are most affected are the lower earners, because effectively they pay back at a higher marginal rate. So the effect of all this freezing, and if it continues now to 2029, is to make the lower earner, someone who just hovers above that threshold value, makes them pay back something like a 12% rate compared to what they expected to be doing, which was a 9% rate payback. And you can see for the higher earner, they're much less affected. And it's not just that higher effective payback rate, it's also the volatility of all this. So when you're hovering around threshold, you're having student loan company make adjustments here, there and everywhere on what they take back directly from your monthly or your annual pay packet. And it really is very hard to legislate and budget properly in those circumstances. While I've been making these videos in the early part of 2026, I've become increasingly concerned by the media attention given to graduate debt and exploitative interest rates accruing on graduate debt. And it's coming from the right-wing press mostly. And, you know, I think it's, in a lot of cases, it's contrived. And then we've got Reform telling outright lies in a video that I've put into the main parts of the essays in which we analyse. And they exploit really common and natural misconceptions about student loans, because most people think student loans are like mortgages or commercial loans, but they're not. They're nothing like mortgages, principally because the debt is written off at the end of the loan period, and what you pay back, what you were obliged to pay back, is not related to your level of debt, it's related to your level of income above a threshold. So 2 graduates on £60,000 a year, one with £10,000 worth of debt, the other with £500,000 worth of student debt, they would pay back exactly the same amount in that tax year. They also imply that governments have cheated on interest. Well, governments have cheated on thresholds, but they've never cheated on interest. When you sign up to applying to loan, you're clearly made aware of the interest that will apply. RPI plus 3 during study, and then RPI up to RPI plus 3 according to the level of salary you earn. And the government have never reneged on that, unlike thresholds. In fact, when inflation was running at a high level in 2022 and 23 at 11%, and therefore Plan 2 graduates should have been paying back at between 11 and 14%, the government actually stepped in and capped interest rates to 7%. And they want to distract your attention by always talking about debt mountains, and you can't even pay off the interest accruing on your debt. They want to make you look at this picture and compare it with what it would be for an interest-free loan, and distract you from looking at the real picture. Here's what you should be looking at. Here I've tabulated 2 cases, one at 0% interest-free, one at 6%. And I've taken some low, mid and high earners. Again, someone above threshold, just above threshold, someone comfortably above threshold, say at £20,000 to £30,000 above threshold for all their working life, and a high earner, a really high flyer. And you can see, can't you, that in these cases, the low earner was unaffected entirely by any interest accruing on his debt. He would pay back the same £19,000 over the 30 years of his debt, whether that was 0%, 6% or 100%. The mid-earner is paying back 1% more over the lifetime of the debt as a percentage of their total earnings over this period. And here's the real eye-catching figure. Because when the debt is interest-free, the really high earner pays back proportionally less than the mid-earner and barely more than the low earner. But when you actually accrue interest on debt, the effect is the high earner, just like the rest or the most of graduates, just simply has to pay back more years at 9% over threshold. And that begins to bring their percentage of lifetime earnings rate up to something like the mid-earner. So in fact, if you watch Student Loan Farce Part 2, I hope to convince you that actually applying interest on debt is a progressive thing to do. I'll also make the contention that many graduates, possibly, and this depends on the way you model it, possibly the majority of graduates are totally unaffected by interest rate on debt. In this chart, I show beneath this white boundary and in red all those cases where even if the interest was 0%, the student or the graduate would never pay off their debt within 30 years. And because they would never pay their debt off in 30 years at 9% over threshold, it doesn't matter what interest rate you apply on it, because again, the interest is written off at the end of that 30-year period. And if you look at it on a slightly different basis, that same group here are simply paying back 9% of their earnings over threshold for the full 30 years of the loan period. To this side of the boundary, and here we're getting into the really top 10, 5, 4% of owners, because they can pay back their debt within 30 years at 9% over earnings, they're paying back effectively a much lesser rate compared to the lower graduate or the lower earning graduate over threshold or the graduate with bigger debts. Think doctors. And, actually, when you apply an interest rate to the student debt, what you're doing is actually putting everyone in the same boat. So if I interest, the interest rate to 100%, then everyone is now just simply paying back 9% of earnings over threshold for the 30 years period. It doesn't get any worse than that. So if I apply a high or an infinite interest accruing rate on debt, I just recapture the graduate tax we were always told was what student loans were back in 2010. And that begs the question that if the higher earners now pay back 9% of earnings above threshold, just like everyone else, if you like, then that must raise a hell of a lot more revenue for the government. And then that begs the question, well, could we have a graduate tax which gets rid of tuition fees, student loans, debt mountains, accrued interest? Could we pitch a lower rate of a graduate tax? And you can answer that question by going to this wonderful facility that the Institute for Fiscal Studies provides. And I'll be giving full details of this in part 3 of the series. So what you can do in this calculator is they have a default setting, which is basically modelling the 2025 graduate contingent on the current Plan 5 plan. And then you can pick alternatives and you can compare what the alternative does against what the current Plan 5 does. And here I've simply said, look, I want to have a graduate tax with a threshold at £30,000. So it's a tax you'll pay above £30,000. And I'm going to set the tax rate at 5%, so not 9%, but 5%. And I'm going to set it for a 30-year loan term. And I played around with this. I mean, I tried various figures here until I got something which showed on this key metric of the cost of loan per borrower, I got something comparable to the existing Plan 5 arrangement. Now, in part 3, I'll show you how I also modelled something around the 5% as something that would bring the same revenue as the current Plan 5 of 9% over 40 years. So, I mean, here's the real tragedy. We could have had a graduate tax applied, which would have swept away all the nonsense of a personalised loan debt arrangement. But it gets even more interesting because what the IFS model there was a graduate tax levied on just the same cohorts of graduates since 2012 who've been taking out student loan plans. Back in 2011, these academics spearheaded a team that suggested actually if you had something called an all-age graduate tax, and that meant you would tax not only that cohort of students who then entered in the system in 2012 and thereafter, which is a very unfair arrangement anyway, isn't it? It's a cliff edge generation. It's as unfair as the waspy woman, suddenly having the pension age height. A much fairer arrangement is simply to tax all graduates who are still working in the UK, who'd ever benefited from university education, and by increasing the tax base, you actually make it a more efficient and a much fairer system. And to think that this was actually advised and recommended back in 2011, and that coalition government, which, had Clegg and Cable in it, they'd already capitulated over tuition fees. They could have actually had the backbone to say, hold on, this is a much better arrangement than a Plan 2 arrangement. And it's not as if this hasn't been recommended again. Same question in 2017 or thereabouts. The advice to this parliamentary committee was exactly the same. And you can read this at your leisure. So I'd really ask you, if you are a graduate with a Plan 2 or a Plan 5 loan scheme, Ask your parents if they're graduates. Ask them, would you have been willing to pay a graduate tax of between 1% and 2% over, say, a 30k threshold? Would you have been willing to pay that? So I wouldn't have had to have a student loan scheme. I wouldn't have had to go through this fiction of tuition fees, tuition fees which are charged the same regardless of the quality of the service. And, I'm talking about the current anger over people during COVID having to pay the same tuition fee for a much poorer level of service. Would you have paid 1% and 2% of your salary over £30,000 so that you and I would basically be in the same boat and paying the same level of tax at perhaps 1% and 2%? Ask them that. So my conclusion is there are real problems with the Plan 2 and the Plan 5 loans, but don't be distracted by debt mountains and interest. The really big problem is that they are toxic. The terms of the underlying loan could change during its 30 or 40-year lifetime. So let's first legislate to make sure that can never happen. And put the actual contract that the threshold should rise in line with earnings into the actual terms of the loan and make that retroactive. And generally legislate to make the loan agreement tamper-proof by current or future governments. But then I would say, let's go a step further. That whole arrangement of student debt and loan is a horrible, personalised construct for essentially a graduate tax. Let's just not be afraid to call it what it is. Let's be bold enough to enact and retroactively apply an all-age graduate tax. We're a group of 10 million graduates or parents of graduates with a real interest in this, and I really urge you to put all your effort behind campaigning and voting for an all-age graduate tax.